Good morning. We're learning Tractate Shabbos, page 132, and Perek also, the 19th chapter. The name of the chapter is Abelezer the Milah. For indeed, if it prescribed time lapse, the obligation is voided. Therefore, the Torah allowed its preliminaries to override the Shabbos restrictions. The same cannot be said of the mitzvah of circumcision. The mitzvah of circumcision, milah, may be performed up until the moment of one's death. Each of the other mitzvahs, on the other hand, has a circumscribed appointed time. You see it in note 2. On the third line, it says, has a circumscribed, appointed time. Omer on the second day of Pesach, 2 loaves on Shavuos, lulav on the first day of Sukkot. Biblical requirement, and even in the case of Sukkah, which operates for all 7 days of the festival, on each day there is a separate obligation to dwell in the Sukkah. Hence, if the Shabbos restrictions are observed, that day's mitzvah will have been voided. So, in other words, we see a big difference between a mitzvah that you're going to miss, you're never going to be able to do it anymore, and the mitzvah of milah that you really are obligated to do it until your last day. Right. If your father didn't do it for you, then you're commanded to do it. So why would the preliminaries of that mitzvah override Shabbos? We understand the mitzvah should override Shabbos, but remember, according to Rabbi Menashe, even the preliminaries, like cutting the fell of the tree, right? Right, making the knife, burning it, preparing all these things, shouldn't override the Shabbos, because if he missed it, you know what? He didn't do circumcision on the 8th day, but he can do it on the 9th and the 10th and the 11th. He still did the mitzvah. So obviously, it's not mitzvah bismano, it's not the best time, but the mitzvah obligation is still there.
Yeah, how many kids are jaundiced do they have?
But Sukkot, for example, if you miss the first day, every day has its own separate obligation. Right. If you miss shofar, that's it. The Rosh Hashanah is over. You can't blow the shofar on some Gedalia. On the 3rd of Tishrei, 4th of Tishrei, it's over.
I got to pick up the shofar.
So, Ela, Ainu Tam de Rabbi Lezer, rather, is Rabbi Lezer's reason for holding that Milah's preliminaries override the Shabbos restrictions. The Pasuk says on the 8th day, he should circumcise. He needs to be circumcised, afilu b'Shabbos, and you shall perform the preliminaries of Milah on the 8th day, whenever that may be, even on the Shabbos day. Let the merciful one write the law of preliminaries in the passage of circumcision. How come the pasuk doesn't tell us that we can do the preliminaries of Milah? Let all the other cases come and be derived from it through Mamatzinu exegesis. Why are separate teachings required for each mitzvah? Because there are grounds to refute the Mamatzinu teaching as follows. Whereas the mitzvah of circumcision is unique, for indeed 13 covenants were made over it. And if you look at number 7, it says in the passage wherein Avram received the commandment of circumcision, Genesis 17:1. Good morning. The word covenant appears 13 times, which indicates the mitzvah's great importance. 13 times the word milah is mentioned in regards to the bris in Genesis 17:1, 22. 1 to 22. So, the same cannot be said of any other mitzvahs. Hence, because milah is invested with this special significance, it cannot serve as the instructive source of Mamatzinu to teach the law of preliminaries universally. This all started, right? We had this. This is all a continuous discussion, going all the way back to the Mishnah.
Right. The first mission of Parak.
This going all the way to, I believe, Kuf Lamed.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Rabbi Eliezer really went all the way out on this mitzvah of circumcision, and he said, we may fell trees to make charcoal in order to make an instrument of iron. Even you're allowed to make, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you're allowed to make the knife on Shabbos. The rabbis, Rabbi Akiva on the other hand, said that any kind of work that can be done before Shabbos should be done before Shabbos.
Right.
So preparing the knife, bringing the knife, all these things can be done before Shabbos.
Right.
So you shouldn't do it on Shabbos.
Right. You have a week to prepare.
Just curious, he keeps on mentioning over and over again the we keep on seeing it again and again. It says, you just see what Mishum De'ikar HaMifrach we just read, because there are grounds to refute the Mamatzinu teaching. So I wanted to go back to see the Mamatzinu teaching that we discussed back then. I want to see where is it mentioned. And I saw it yesterday also a few times. It speaks about the Mamatzinu teaching. See if you find it.
No, I wasn't looking. Anyway, without logic, you could build a sukkah on Shabbos. With the logic of the Mamatzinu, why couldn't you build
I want to see the what exactly he mean by the logic of Mamatzinu.
Talking about the Sforah, I'm not talking about, whatever. On 38 too, in the right. Well, when he went in about covering the knife, and then he went into he digressed after that about the bird and the milk. Sneaking the knife into the
Yeah, I see. So Rabbi Eliezer derived the law only from a Gezer Shava derivation. Let's see if he mentions it there. Gezer Shava is one of the 13 methods of biblical exegesis propounded by Rabbi Shmuel in introduction to Sifra. We will state the two similar words. In the Rashi, Gezer Shava rather you could. If it was a tradition from his teacher, all preliminaries of Rabbi Menashe Amitay. Why did he have to rely on Gezer Shava to establish that law?
No, as it goes on, I think you get, going to the Gemara more, I think you'll find you'll get what you want.
No, that's the thing. I think it was already mentioned before, and he's just referring back to this Mamatzinu, refute to the Mamatzinu teaching. So I want to see the Mamatzinu teaching. Unless you find it.
Look at 11 on 132A1, maybe that helps.
Okay, almost there.
I know we didn't get to that. We didn't go through the
132, you said?
132A1, 11 in the bottom. We didn't get there, in our learning yet, but I think it's shy for what you're looking at. There's also in the 40s, there's a Rashi and a Ritva on this.
Here I see, for example, 131b3, if you look at the right column, it says, because there are grounds to refute the Mamatzinu teaching. You see, so it means that Mamatzinu teaching was already mentioned previously. If you look at 131b3, the right column, it says in the top, Mishum deikal mifrach, the second paragraph from the top. There are grounds to refute the Mamatzinu teaching as follows. Where's the Mamatzinu teaching? Whereas the mitzvah of matzah is unique, for indeed it operates with respect to women as respect to men. Let's see 33, although women are because which says Mangrama. So the Mamatzinu teaching was already way before. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, so it gives an example. It's one of the principles of like formulas of learning. Okay.
Rabbi Shmuel.
Rabbi Shmuel. No, it's not. It's not the 13th principle, but it's like it's almost like a formula. It says like this. For example, he writes, yain, right? Wine is an obligation in Nesachim, right?
Right.
You bring libation of Minchas Nesachim. but also as an adava. You can also bring wine as a voluntary donation, right? The gift. Shemen, on the other hand, shemen is an obligation in a sochim, and you can also bring nadava, right? Both wine and oil, without soiles, without fine flour. Binyan av esh cholkim. It's not clear so much. Ma'amatzinu limud. So you said limud ma'amatzinu is a binyan av. Binyan av. It's almost like I would say it's like a kavachayma. Mamatzinu. It says Mamatzinu. Matzilumid binyan av. Afayo mamatzinu lo yafinu manu meisuro yafinu mina b'kavachayma. You mentioned the ritva before, right?
Yeah.
Also write it over here.
And Rashi also, and MHK. Who's it?
You see, it's the concept of overriding learning Torah. For example, to do a mitzvah that cannot be done by other people, right?
Right.
So one overrides the other. So Mamatzinu is probably associated with the Mishnah in the first chapter. That's why I wanted to go there, because maybe over here using this language, although I didn't see it. Who's using this expression, Mamatzinu? So it seems like it's the referencing to other places where you would override the Shabbos. Like, for example, we mentioned shofar, sukkah, lulav, all these things that are mitzvahs that have to be done on that day, and they override the Shabbos. That's Mamatzinu, meaning that I'm creating a reference to other places where we override the Shabbos. Same, like we had speaking about Milah on Shabbos, but comes the Gemara and gives you reference to other sources where you also override the Shabbos. And then discussion yesterday was like to tell you, hey, but they're not exactly similar.
Right.
And for example, the mitzvah of matzah. We said the matzah is for men and women. Bris is only for men. Right. So why would you compare the two? Right. And now we're learning that the 13 times the mitzvah of bris was mentioned in the pasuk in Bereshis, and it's a very special mitzvah. You write over here is this mitzvah because Milah is invested with this special significance. Yeah. So why would you compare it to other? So he says because there are grounds to refute the Mamatzinu, and there's grounds to refute what is Matzinu. I mean, what Matzinu we find. What did we find? So I guess we found other places that it has the same thing. It has the same concept as overriding the Shabbos. Right. So he said you can refute the Mamatzinu. You can refute the similarities, the comparison that you make. Because bris is significant. What's so significant about bris? Okay, I hope it's makes it a little clearer. The Gemara now debates the biblical source for circumcision itself, overriding the Shabbos restriction. Shabbos restrictions. Ad kan lepliga rabbono leila machshir milah. only until here do the rabbis argue with Rabbi Eliezer in this matter only concerning the preliminaries to the mitzvah of circumcision. Aval milagufa, however, with regard to the circumcision itself, the opinion of all is that it overrides the Shabbos restrictions. Menalan, from where do we know this? Amaula halacha. Ula said it is the law, it is a law taught orally to Moshe on Mount Sinai. And it is not derived from the written Torah. V'chen Omar Rabbi Yitzchak halacha, and so said Rabbi Yitzchak, it is a law taught orally to Moshe on Mount Sinai. Meisive, they objected on the evidence of a Baisa Minayin lepikuach nefesh adeiches haShabbos. From where is it derived that saving a life overrides the Shabbos restriction? Where do we know it? We always say pikuach nefesh adeiches Shabbos. Good morning, Mr. Gelman. Good morning,
Good morning.
David. So how do we know that pikuach nefesh overrides the Shabbos? Saving a life overrides the Shabbos. Everybody says pikuach nefesh doch Shabbos. Where is it written? Where is it taken from? Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah oimer. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says, "Ma mila she echad me'evorov shel odom." Circumcision. What is circumcision? It's one of a person's limbs. It's one of your limbs. It's part of your body. Deiches Shabbos overrides the Shabbos restriction. Kal v'chomer lepikuach nefesh. All the more so saving a life. If it enters your mind that the source for Mila's power to override the Shabbos is a law taught orally to Moshe at Sinai, if you would say that the reason why Mila or Pikuach Nefesh override Shabbos is because it's halacha, meaning when we say it's halacha, that it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai, that we have a tradition from Moshe at Sinai. V'atanya mioti can a kal v'chomer come for such a law? Meaning a kal v'chomer has logical inference, have such a power to come and override Shabbos. V'atanya I called Boch Gelman, Mr. Gelman. So he write me, call me Boch, don't call Mr. Gelman. Sorry, Boch.
Is he at home still? Or
I don't know, maybe watching from work. Boch for important people, you call him Mr. Right?
Yeah.
You're a very important guy.
Back in the day, everybody was Mr. when I was growing up.
Yeah. Anyhow, so it's kal v'chomer ma'alocha. So can a kal v'chomer come from such a law? V'atanya, it was explicitly taught otherwise in a Bais. Amar Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah Akiva. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah said to Akiva, "Etzim keseir o metam halacha." A barley-sized bone contaminates. If a nazir touches a bone that is the size of a barley, it becomes tummy, even though it's so small. Through touching or carrying. So that a nazir is obligated to shave his head and recommence his nazirus. He has to start all over again. There's an old law taught to Moshe at Sinai. Urvis dam kal v'chomer. And from there, you sought to derive that contamination by a quarter log of a corpse's blood likewise causes him to shave and recommence his nazirus through a kal v'chomer argument. But we do not reason kal v'chomer from an oral law, inasmuch as the 13 rules of biblical exegesis cannot be applied to the oral law. From here we may conclude that the law that Milah overrides the Shabbos, which is the basis of the first Braisas Kal Vachomer, through which we derive that saving a life also overrides the Shabbos, cannot be an oral law from Sinai. And Gemara suggests a different biblical source for the law that Milah overrides Shabbos. How do we know that bris, circumcision, overrides Shabbos? El Amar Bilozor Asya Ois Ois. The law of overriding for Milah is derived through the Gezerah Shava of sign. Ois Ois. Ois is a sign. What do we say on Shabbos? Ki Ois hi beini uven bnei Yisrael. We said in the Kiddush, Ois. It's a sign between Hashem and us. What do we say about the bris? It's also Ois. Hashem makes a sign, Simon, in your body. With reference to Shabbos, the Torah stated, Ki Ois hi, it is a sign. And with reference to circumcision, it says, V'hoyo le'ois beris, and it shall be a sign of the covenant. Genesis 17:11. So the common word sign intimates, just as there in the first passage, the word refers to Shabbos, so here in the passage of Milah, it refers to Shabbos, to teach that Shabbos is a time for Milah. So if you are asked, how do you know that circumcision overrides Shabbos? So you say the Gemara, Masechta Shabbos 132, says in the name of Rabbi Lezer, Ois is written in regards to Shabbos, sign, and Ois is written in regards to Milah, Bayale Ois Beris, which is written in regards to the Bris. Ela me'ato, but according to that, the tefillin dichtiv b'hem ois. What about tefillin? It says also ois, sign in regards to tefillin. Vayole ois al yodecho, u'letzoitecho es be'enecho. Leitche Shabbos. So maybe tefillin should override Shabbos. Why don't we put tefillin on Shabbos?
Because Shabbos is a sign. We don't even know the sign.
But it says ois in regards to tefillin also.
Yeah, I know.
Ela asyu bris beris. Rather, the law of overriding for Milah is derived through the Gezerah Shava of covenant. So it's not ois. Rather, the reason it says beris about Shabbos, beris beinu uveinechem, right? What is stay with me, Shmuel. You say beris beinu uveinechem. The law of overriding for Milah is derived through Gezerah Shava of covenant. If you look at 16, it tells you beris ledor. The word beris, covenant, is mentioned in reference to Shabbos. A doy roisam beris oilam. We said the word beris oilam, and it says the same thing about the bris milah, obviously. God the dichtive beris lidche Shabbos. So, but the milah of an uncircumcised adult, concerning whom the word covenant is also written, lidche Shabbos, should likewise override the Shabbos restrictions, and we know that it does not. Hence, covenant is not the authentic Gezerah Shava. There is halacha in regards to bris, circumcision, bris milah, that it overrides Shabbos only if the baby was born naturally, and if it's on the 8th day. So, a baby that had the jaundice and was weak or whatever it is that they couldn't do the bris on time, they never scheduled the bris on Shabbos. The only time the bris is scheduled on Shabbos when he was born the previous Shabbos, and the baby was born naturally, is healthy, everything is fine, he is circumcised on Shabbos. But if somebody, for some reason, his parents did not circumcise him, and he decided he wants to be circumcised, it's never going to be done on Shabbos. It does not override Shabbos. So therefore, you cannot learn it from Beris, from the Gezerah Shava, from the logical inference or Gezerah Shava of Beris. Godol dichtive Beris idche Shabbos elatzia deros. Rather, maybe we should learn it from the word doiros. What does doiros means? Generations. So it says in regard to bris milah doiros, and it says in regarding Shabbos generations also. If you want to know the psukim, we say uven shmoinas yomim, if a baby is 8 days, imoy lochem kol zochor le doiroisechem, 4 generations. And what does it say about Shabbos? Le doroisem beris oilam, which is also this is reference to Shabbos. The Gemara says, but regarding tzitzis also it says doros. Tzitzis dechtiv v'doros lidche Shabbos, so maybe tzitzis should override Shabbos. El amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Dolin ois beris v'doros. Me ois beris v'doros. We learn about the mitzvah of milah, concerning which is written the word sign, ois, and it says also covenant beris, and it says doirois, generation. Me ois beris v'doros. We're looking for something similar that has these 3 elements: ois, bris, and doirois. Sign, covenant, and generations. To exclude these other mitzvahs, for only one of these words is written by each of them. Hence, the rabbis and Rabbi Elazar derive that milah itself overrides the Shabbos restriction from the Gezerah Shavah of sign, covenant, and generation. That's really an amazing Gezerah Shavah, because Beris has these 3 words written in it: Ois, Beris, and Doros, and Shabbos has these 3 things: Ois, Beris, and Doros. And from here we learned that circumcision overrides the Shabbos, because they have equal words that are written in regards to both of them. Ois, a sign; Beris, covenant, and generations. The rabbis derive that milah itself overrides the Shabbos from that which the pasuk stated on the 8th day, which implies bayoim afilu b'Shabbos. You should perform the mitzvah of milah on the 8th day, whenever that may be, even on the Shabbos day. Omar le Rish Lakish to Rabbi Yochanan. Rish Lakish said to Rabbi Yochanan, Ela me'ato. But according to that, mechusrei chaporo dechtiv b'u bayim, those who lack atonement, concerning which the phrase on the 8th day is also written. Hochinami de dochu Shabbos. It should also be true that they override the Shabbos restrictions. What does it mean, those who lack atonement? Why are they lacking atonement? So look at 27. It says this refers to tom individuals, such as Metzora, Zav, Zava, and a woman who has given birth, who must bring sacrifices to attain complete purification. So they're almost there, but they have to bring a korban to complete the purification. Achanami de dochu Shabbos. So it should also be true that they override the Shabbos restrictions, and we know they do not. Hence, on the day cannot imply, when it says on the day bayoim, cannot imply even on the Shabbos day. Only bailo is indeed to teach that their offerings are brought during the day and not at night. Hence, it is not free to teach that their offerings are brought and slaughtered even on the Shabbos. If so, say that this on the day in the milah passage is also needed to teach that circumcision is performed during the day and not at night. Accordingly, it cannot teach that milah overrides the Shabbos. That law is derived from a different pasuk. At the age of 8 days, every male among you shall be circumcised. The word days is extraneous, and thus teaches that milah must be performed during the day. This law also is derived from a different pasuk. On the day God commanded the children of Israel to bring their offerings. On the day in each passage is free to teach that particular Tamiz's offering overrides the Shabbos restrictions. So a person that is Tameh, according to this, is allowed to bring his korban on Shabbos. Even though the law that sacrifices are brought only by day is derived generally from on the day God commanded, it is necessary to repeat it vis-a-vis those who lack atonement. It would enter your mind that I might say, since the merciful one had compassion on the Tameh, allowing him to bring a lesser sacrifice in his poverty, let him bring it at night as well. Kamashmalan, on the day in each passage, informs us that the Tameh sacrifices, or the Tameh sacrifice must be brought during the day. Matkifla Ravina challenges Rabbi Yochanan, Ela Ma'ata, but according to that, he has Zar Kasher Ben. Let a stranger, a non-Kohen, be qualified for their bringing. Veyeh Onen Kasher Ben, and let Onen be qualified for their bringing. Adrei Krat, Adrei Krat, the verse on the day, Bayom, on the day, explicitly returned the purification offering of the day, one lacking atonement, to the general category of temple offerings. Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation is thus still valid. What does Shemini means? On the 8th day, Shemini afilu b'Shabbat. You shall perform the mitzvah of Brit Milah, of circumcision, on whenever it happens to be, whenever the 8th day falls on, even on Shabbat. The word 8th is indeed, or is needed to exclude the performing of Milah on the 7th day. You shouldn't, if your son circumcision falls on Shabbat, you're not allowed to do the Brit on Friday. Say, okay, I'll do it on the 7th day instead of the 8th day, on the 9th day instead of the 8th day. The Milah overrides Shabbat. Shvi mi ben shmonat yamim nafka, that Milah is not performed on the 7th day, is derived from the other pasuk. How do we know that Shvi'i, at the age of 8 days, every male among you shall be circumcised? Hence the word 8 is free for exegesis. Still, one of those verses is needed to exclude the performing of Milah on the 7th day, and one is needed to exclude the performing of Milah on the 9th day. One to rule out the 7th day, and one to rule out the 8th day. For if we were to expound from just one of those verses, I would think that it is Milah on the 7th day that the Torah precludes. The lo mata zimne, it's the time not yet arrived. But since he reached the 8th day, he reached his time now, so maybe I can push it for the 9th day. Accordingly, the word 8th is not free to teach that Milah overrides Shabbos, for it teaches that only the 8th day is the proper time for the mitzvah of Milah. Rather, the answer is clear according to the explanation of Rabbi Yochanan, who said above that the rabbis derived the law for Milah itself from on the day. It was taught in a Bais in accordance with Rabbi Yochanan, and not in accordance with Rabbi Yaakov. Shmini imol, and on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised, which means, afilu b'Shabbos, you shall perform the mitzvah of Milah on whatever happens to be the 8th day, even on Shabbos. And how do I establish the verse? Shabbos desecrators shall be put to death with regard to those who perform any of other forbidden labors besides circumcision, or indeed it is not so, but even circumcision is prohibited on pain of death. And how do I establish the verse? And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised chutz mishabbos. It means that the time for milah is the 8th day, except when the day is the Shabbos. Talmud Leima Bayom, to preclude the latter interpretation, the Torah state on the day, which implies afilu b'Shabbos. You should perform the mitzvah of milah on the 8th day, whenever that may be, even on the Shabbos day. Why to this Tana was it originally appropriate to interpret on the 8th day? And in the end, what was difficult to him about his initial reasoning? On the 8th day, he shall be circumcised. Comes to teach that milah is to be performed on the 8th day, afilu b'Shabbos, even when it falls on Shabbos. How do I establish its desecrators shall be put to death? With regard to those who perform any of the other forbidden labors besides circumcision. However, circumcision overrides the Shabbos restrictions. My time. What is the reason? Kal v'chomer. It is a kal v'chomer argument that established this as follows. Uma tzaras, inasmuch as tzaras, prohibition, leprosy, is stringent shederchas ha'avodah, that for it overrides the sacrificial service obligation. V'avodah dorchas ha'Shabbos, and the sacrificial service override the Shabbos. Mila doicho iso Shabbos. Mila doicho oiso Shabbos shenitchas mipnei avodah. And yet the mitzvah of circumcision overrides the tzaras prohibition. Mila doicho iso. And yet the mitzvah of circumcision overrides the tzaras prohibition. It says in number 2, one performs the mitzvah even if its tzaras spot is found on the foreskin and will be cut off as a result of the circumcision. Remember, in the mitzvah of tzaras, you're not supposed to remove the sign. Right. So if somebody see a sign, he needs to show it to the Kohen, at least back then.
Right.
And if you cut it off, it's avera. You're not. They can't detect it if it is or not. What happened if the mark is on the foreskin, the tzaras?
They still have the mitzvah.
You go along with the mitzvah even though you're removing the sign.
Right.
So Shabbos with regard to Shabbos which is overridden on account of the sacrificial service. Is it not logical the circumcision should override it? It was the logic of this kal v'chomer that initially caused the Tana to interpret on the 8th literally and its desecrator loosely. Interesting, like you have a baby already that has a tzaras. If for sure they didn't say lashon hara. And what is the explanation for the Tana stating, or indeed it is not so, which implies that he was reversing himself, and the now maintains that milah is included in the verse, its desecrator shall be put to death. What difficulty forced the Tana to retract? From where do you know that tzaras is more stringent, that the Shabbos restrictions tzaras is more stringent than the Shabbos restrictions, which was the very premise of the kal v'chomer argument. Perhaps the Shabbos is more stringent, for indeed it carries many penalties and prohibitions. And as for the fact that tzaras prohibition overrides the sacrificial service, from what proof do we know that it does so? Because tzaras is inherently more stringent than the service. Perhaps the reason we do not advise the Kohen to remove the tzaras spot and then bring the sacrifice is because he is still not a ritually fit person. And if so, the entire kal v'chomer is undermined. Hence, its desecrators shall be put to death should encompass even milah on the 8th day. And how then do I establish the verse on the 8th day? The flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Chutz mishabbos, it perforce means that milah shall be performed on every 8th day except for the Shabbos. Talmud leimar bayoim, and to preclude this very interpretation, the Torah states on the day, which implies afilu b'Shabbos. You should perform the mitzvah of milah on the 8th day, whenever that may be, even on the Shabbos day. The Tana uses Rabbi Yochanan Exodus to prove that milah indeed overrides the Shabbos restrictions. Rabbi Yochanan Exodus is thereby corroborated. The Gemara stated above that the mitzvah of milah overrides the tzaras prohibition. The Gemara now discusses the biblical source of this law. Tanu Rabban milah derech es hatzaras, the mitzvah of circumcision override the tzaras. As we just said before, if a baby has on his foreskin tzaras, you're allowed to remove it. You're not trying to remove it. You're trying to do the bris. Although it's inevitable, but you have to do the mitzvah of bris, and mitzvah of bris overrides tzaras. How do we know? Whenever it's performed, whether it is performed on its time or later, maybe the bris was pushed off. Yom Tov Eina Derech Alav Zman Bilvad. Circumcision overrides the festival melacha restrictions only when performed at its proper time. Meaning you can do bris on Yom Tov only if it's the proper time, it's the 8th day. Menan and Milah, how do we know this? From where do we derive this law that milah overrides the tzaras prohibition? Even Scripture expressly states, take heed concerning the affliction of tzaras. Ishomer minega tzaras. Tanu rabbonon imo b'sar losei. Flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised, which means va'afilu she'va'af al pi she'eshem baheres yokoitz. Even though a baheres spot, a type of tzaras, is there on the foreskin, he shall cut it off. And how do I do what do I do about the commandment? Ishomer b'negat tzaras. Take heed concerning the affliction of tzaras, that you shouldn't mess with the tzaras, which prohibits the removal of tzaras. All other places except on the foreskin. If it goes on the foreskin, you remove it. Maybe the Ishomer b'negat tzaras, be careful, beware, not to mess with the tzaras. Maybe it's even when it's on the foreskin. What are you going to do with another pasuk? It says imol b'sal, you have to remove the foreskin. So what do? One tells you don't touch the tzaras. One tells you to remove the foreskin. Bizman she'ein bo baheres. The pasuk applies at a time that there is no baheres spot on the foreskin. Talmud leimar besar. To preclude the latter interpretation of the Torah states the flesh besar olosei, which teaches afal pi she'eshem baheres, even though baheres spot is there on the foreskin, you may perform the circumcision. Holding in 132b2. Amar Rabbi Tonomi Koromai Nichale. Why to this Tana was it originally appropriate to interpret the milah verse literally and the tzaras verse loosely, and not including milah in the prohibition? And in the end, what was difficult to him about his initial reasoning? The flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised teaches that the foreskin is cut off in all cases. And even though there is a baheres spot on it, and although I establish, take heed concerning the affliction of tzaras, all other places besides circumcision. Circumcision override the tzaras prohibition. My taimo. Why circumcision overrides tzaras? Because we'll learn it from a kal v'chomer logical inference. Shabbos chamura, since Shabbos law is more stringent than tzaras law. Mila docha oiso. Shabbos is more stringent than tzaras, and mila docha oiso. Mila and circumcision override Shabbos. How much more so that it should override tzaras? How does Shabbos is more chamur than tzaras? From where do we know Shabbos is more stringent than tzaras? It says in 22, for it contains many penalties and prohibition. In tzaras, you have the Ishomer B'nei Tzaras. That's it. When it comes to Shabbos, you have so many penalties that are associated with Shabbos, so many warnings, so many positive and negative commandments. So what's the logic? If Shabbos overrides Tzaras, how much more so that Milah, that overrides Shabbos, should override Tzaras? Get it?
Yeah.
Umay or ino the Komar, and what is the explanation of the Tana stating, or indeed it is not so, which implies that he was reversing himself and now maintains that Milah is included in the prohibition against cutting off tzaras. What difficulty forced the Tana to retract? Adar Komar Mimai Shabbos Chamira. From what proof do we know that Shabbos law is more stringent than the tzaras prohibition? Maybe tzaras is more stringent than Shabbos. How do we know that Shabbos is more stringent than tzaras? For indeed it overrides the sacrificial service. And the sacrificial service in turn overrides the Shabbos. There's a lot of sacrificial service that was done on Shabbos. On Shabbos day, you bring shtei kvosim, an added korban. Beside the korban tamid, you're bringing more korbanos on Shabbos.
Right.
That's why we say musaf. What is musaf?
Right.
An added korban.
Right.
So obviously, avodah, doing work on Shabbos, in these cases, the avodah of korbanos, the work with the korbanos is overriding Shabbos. Why? So maybe tzaras is more stringent. Why? What's the train of thought? Because tzaras derches avodah. You're not allowed to do sacrificial service if you're a leopard, right?
Right.
So means tzaras is stronger than the avodah. But on the other hand, the avodah is stronger than Shabbos.
Right.
To preclude such a conclusion, the Torah states the flesh, an extraneous word. Why do you have to mention besar? That you do a bris even if the tzaras is right there on the foreskin. By doing so, you getting rid of the evidence.
Right.
Another version. Mila dechas hatzaras. Mila overrides circumcision, overrides the tzaras. My time, what is the reason? Because comes aseh, which is a positive commandment, aseh, and overrides lot aseh, against cutting off. Right? Cutting off is lot aseh. Mitzvah, the mitzvah of bris is aseh, is do. So the do overrides the don't do. Okay? Umay or the koma. And what is the explanation for the Tana stating, or indeed, it is not so, which implies a restriction. Retraction. He is retracting from what he said.
Yeah.
So the Tana subsequently said to himself, Eimar, one could say that we say that a positive commandment comes and overrides a negative commandment. When the former conflicts with only a negative commandment, this is a case of a positive commandment in conflict with another positive commandment. This is a case of positive commandment in conflict with another positive commandment and a negative commandment. Under these circumstances, the two positive commandments offset one another. Accordingly, Mila cannot override the Tzaras prohibition. Deuteronomy 24:8 in note 28 states in full, "Take heed concerning the Tzaras affliction." This is the prohibition against cutting off Tzaras. To be very careful and to act, right? According to everything that the Kohanim, the Levites, shall teach you, as I have commanded them, you should be careful to perform this. You should be careful to perform. This is a positive commandment to follow the Kohen directions during verification of Tzaras procedure. So it's an interesting case when you have aseh and aseh.
Right.
You have one aseh that tells you to do something, and you have loit aseh that tells you don't do it.
Right.
So if the don't do has within it also aseh,
Yeah.
or if the aseh has within it also loit aseh, if they are enjoined together. So he gives you a case over here. It says, "How though the Koma, the Tana subsequently said to himself," by asking why he retracted, Aseh in general overrides loit aseh. Okay, you do overrides the don't. One could say that we say that a positive command comes and overrides a negative command. Lo yisase greda, when the former conflicts with only a negative commandment, however, this is a case of a positive commandment in conflict with another positive commandment and a negative commandment. Now you have a double header.
Yeah.
They have a positive commandment that conflicts with a positive and negative commandment combined. Under these circumstances, the two positive commandments offset one another. Accordingly, Mila cannot override the Tzaras prohibition because Tzaras prohibition has a positive and a negative commandment. And how then do I do the mitzvah there? It says clearly you have to remove the foreskin. The foreskin shall be circumcised. Bisman shein b'baheres. When do I remove the foreskin? When it doesn't have baheres, it doesn't have the signs of leprosy. But if it has the baheres spot, then maybe I shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Talmud leimar besar. The Torah state besar, which teaches because of the word besar, I learned that even though there is baheres, I need to remove it. The Tana derives that Mila overrides the Tzaras prohibition from the extraneous word besar, flesh. Tinach godo. That exegesis is indeed appropriate for the category of uncircumcised adult. Tichtiv ve'u besar. It says besar. Kota namiksiv besar. And an infant, it's also said besar or lose. Beinoni menalan. From where do we know? From where we derive the tzaras of a child in the middle category may likewise be cut off during the course of circumcision. What does that mean? A child in the middle category. It says in 33, a minor whose circumcision occurs after the 8th day, since he's not liable to punishment, he is not included in Genesis 17:14, and the verses that do obligate first his father and then the community to circumcise him. Respectively, do not contain the extra. So how do we know that a Beinoni means over here a child that is still an infant, but it's past the 8th day,
Yeah.
that it overrides Tzaras? David is asking, it says Sur Mera v'Aseh Tov.
Yeah.
Refrain from evil and then do good.
Yeah.
So, if in the context of Shabbos, refrain from evil would mean not to spill blood on Shabbos.
Right.
But what's the problem with circumcision? You are fixing. You're
Right.
fixing, you
Right.
spilling blood. And on the other hand, it says Aseh Tov. So how can Aseh override Lo Taseh? That's really what you're asking. How can the Aseh of Vayem Hashmini Imol B'Sa'ol Lo, on the 8th day you should circumcise your son, comes and overrides Lo Taseh? You shouldn't spill blood.
Right.
You shouldn't do a melacha, and this is fixing, right? What the answer? Why still Milah override Shabbos? There's many answers to this, but in general, we just said before that Milah, circumcision, the Aseh Tov, the doing the mitzvah of Milah, it's written 13 times in the Torah.
Right.
So it shows its significance and superiority. And we said it's in general, in that specific case, the Aseh overrides Lo Taseh because of the 3 teachings that were said about Shabbos and about Milah. The word Ois, the word Bris, and the word Deos, the word generations. So that's, but in general, you can't do it's called mitzvah ba ba'avera. It's called to do a mitzvah through avera.
Right.
It's like somebody steals $1 from you to give it to someone else at tzedakah.
Right.
So you do tzedakah you do Aseh Tov through Sur Mera, through not being Sur Mera,
Right.
not refraining from you. So that's why you need the rabbis to tell you which Aseh Tov overrides the Sur Mera.
Right.
Amar Rabbi Ose mi beinayo. Good question, David. Good question. Amar Rabbi Ose mi beinayo. It is derived from the 2 categories through a common feature. Migodol Aseh, the middle category, cannot be derived directly from the case of a legal adult. Sheken onus koresh, for indeed an adult who dies uncircumcised is punished with koresh.
Right.
Adult dies without circumcision is punished with koresh. Since the case of an uncircumcised minor lacks the stringency, the law of overriding the tzara's prohibition cannot be inferred to it through mamatzinu. Here we go again, mamatzinu.
Right.
Mikot and la'asyo. Further, the middle category cannot be derived directly from the case of an 8-day-old infant, sheken milo bismano, for indeed that case involves circumcision at its proper time. Since the middle category lacks this significance, we cannot infer that it too overrides the tzara's prohibition. Atzad shover sheboen, the feature common to both of them, the common denominator, the adult and the 8-day-old, shekeni moilim v'derech hatzaras, is that they indeed subject to be circumcised, and their circumcision override the tzara's prohibition. So too in the case of all others who are subject to be circumcised, their circumcisions override the tzara's prohibition. Rabbi Omar, different interpretation of the Brisa. Rabbi Omar, b'zman derech lo tzricha kra. It says regarding circumcision of it at its proper time overrides the tzara's prohibition, does not require a pasuk, a superfluous verse. Mikal v'chomer asya. What is the kal v'chomer? Why we don't need a pasuk if it's milo bezmano, if it's being done in its circumcision is done in its proper time? This is the Kal V'Chomer. Uma Shabbos the Chamir, or Shabbos law is more stringent than Tzaras law. We said it if you look at the note 22, it says, for it contains many penalties and prohibitions. Tzaras, it says, Yishoma b'negat Tzaras. Shabbos has many penalties, many stringencies. Ravo, Ma Shabbos the Chamir, or Doich, or Tzaras, l'kol sheken. But still, Milah overrides Shabbos. So how much more so it should override Tzaras? Amar of Safra Rava. How do we know that Shabbos is so stringent? Mimai the Shabbos Chamira. From what proof do we know that Shabbos law is more stringent than the Tzaras prohibition? Which is the very premise of your Kal V'Chomer. Dilma Tzaras Chamira. Perhaps the Tzaras prohibition is more stringent. Sheken Deichas Aveda. For indeed, it overrides the sacrificial service. And the sacrificial service overrides the Shabbos. Hence, your Kal V'Chomer argument is undermined, is shaky. Perhaps Tzaras prohibition is more stringent. For indeed, it overrides the sacrificial service. From what proof do we know that Shabbos law is more stringent than Tzaras prohibition? Maybe Tzaras is more stringent, for indeed it overrides the sacrificial service. And sacrificial service overrides the Shabbos. Look at note 53 at 132. It says, Kohanim are forbidden to cut off Tzaras spot on their bodies, even if it means that there will be no eligible Kohanim to perform the sacrificial service, and a non-Kohen is forbidden to cut off a Tzaras spot to qualify himself to bring Pesach offering. So you see Tzaras override the Avodah. Even if, imagine, there's no other Kohen, they are not allowed, they can't serve with a Tzaras or potential Tzaras, and they're not allowed to remove the Tzaras on Shabbos.
So you're stuck not doing the Avodah.
Exactly. So what does it show you? That Tzaras is stronger than the Avodah.
Wow.
What was you were trying to say, a Kal V'Chomer, that since Avodah override Shabbos, right? It said, how do you know? It said, so here we go. Tzaras has an element that is very stringent because it doesn't override the Avodah. Actually, Tzaras override the Avodah. V'Avodah doichas Shabbos, and the sacrificial service override the Shabbos. So the Kal V'Chomer is undermined. You see over here that Tzaras is more stringent. And also, your point there that Tzaras law override the sacrificial service, lav mishum de chamira Tzaras. It's not because Tzaras law is inherently more stringent than the service. Ela mishum de gavu de lechozi, but because the Kohen is not a ritually fit person. Hence, you have no proof that Tzaras law is inherently more stringent. It's just a Kohen issue. It's not that Tzaras is stronger. Rav Safra understood Rava to mean that the Kohen is rendered tamei by the Tzaras. For that reason, he is prevented from serving. Amai v'yokus ba'alta v'yavad. Let him cut off his bahera spot and then perform the service. The fact that he doesn't do so, because he is forbidden to cut off the baheres. Hence, the Tzaras prohibition is inherently more stringent than the sacrificial service. When we say avodah, we mean the sacrificial service. And so my argument persists, and the Kal V'Chomer is undermined. The cutting off the baheres will not help, because Removing the baheres is just one step. But in order to be fit to serve, you also have to go to the mikvah, because the kohen is lacking immersion. And even then, disqualified for the remainder of the day. That's what we call tevul yom, that has to wait for the evening to be tahor. Hence, you have no proof that Tzaraas law is more stringent than Shabbos law. Tinach negoim tameim, your answer is appropriate for impure afflictions such as baheres spot, which requires immersion in a mikvah and waiting until evening before purification is achieved. What about negoim tahirim? You have negoim tameim and negoim tahirim. What about pure afflictions? What is pure afflictions? Tzaraas that covers the entire flesh.
Right, then
it's not tomeh. Or faint white spot called bohak. In either case, the affliction does not contaminate the person, whether he has bohak or whether the tzaraas covers the entire flesh. Perforce the kohen does not serve, he is forbidden to do so. And Tzaraas law provides the service, but let the positive commandment of performing sacrificial service come and override the prohibition against cutting of all Tzaraas affliction. In fact, it does not indicate that Tzaraas prohibition is inherently more stringent than the sacrificial service, and so my argument persists, and your kavachemer is under. Elam Ravashi heichad amrin and osi. This is going back to your question, David. It says, where do we say that a positive commandment comes and overrides a negative commandment? Kegoin mila b'tzaras. This is like aseto versus sumera. Kegoin mila b'tzaras. Is, for example, in the case of circumcision with tzaraas present on the foreskin. Oh, this is the example that I was thinking about also, where you see the asad tov overrides the lotus, the overrides the sumera. Inam tzitzis v'chilayim. Alternatively, in the case of tzitzis and the presence of kilayim.
right.
It says in 53, Torah prohibits the wearing of garment that has in it a mixture of wool and linen threads. Now, it is a positive Torah commandment to attach fringes to the corners of one's four-corner garments. The tzitzis at each corner should include a thread of blue dyed wool, and remember the word wool. One who wishes to wear a four-corner garment of linen must attach tzitzis to it, despite the fact that the garment will then contain both linen and wool threads. This indeed is the source in Yevamos for the law that a positive commandment overrides a negative one. Some Rishonim here question, however, whether the case of tzitzis and kilayim itself contains all the requisites for an override situation. See Ramban, however, note from Isur Zalman, Chidush Aran, and Ran Mahak. Where at the very moment the negative commandment is violated, one fulfills a positive commandment. What does it mean? The ve'idna de misaker lav kamei kimaseh. It says in 54, the circumciser cuts off the foreskin and the tzaraas simultaneously. When you do the bris, you remove both of them in one shot. You're killing two birds in one shot. one wears the tzitzis and the mixture of wool and linen simultaneously. Lav loy kamoiki maser, the Kohen is not fulfilling the positive commandment of performing the sacrificial service, since he cuts off the tzaras as a preliminary to serving. The service cannot override, meaning he doesn't do both. He do one at a time. So that's the issue. This dispute of Rava and Rav Safra, Tanoihi, it's actually a dispute of Tanoim. Tanya Besar, because the Torah states on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. The extraneous word flesh teaches, and even though Bahera spot is there on the foreskin and will inevitably be cut off, he shall perform the circumcision. Divrei Rabbi Yeshua. These are the words of Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yonasan says, Einot tzorich. A pasuk is not needed to teach this law, for it may be derived by Kal V'chomer argument, Shabbos Chamura, Doicho, Tzaras L'kol Sheken. Nevertheless, the mitzvah of circumcision at its proper time overrides it, should the category of Milah not certainly override the wicked Tzaras provision. So we'll continue, God willing, tomorrow, and we'll have another video of Shabbos Halacha shortly.